And now a moment of silence, please. Well, they ain't getting any deader. Hey folks, so it's time for us to talk about an LGBTQ plus representation topic. And yeah, I'm skipping the whole taking off the hat, letting the hair down thing. We're just gonna start this way this time, because I figure that by this point, if people have not already caught on to the fact that I am gender fluid and, you know, this is how I look sometimes, and that's why I have a dog in this race, when it comes to representation and things like that, I don't know what to say to those people anymore. So, we're just gonna kick it off right like this. Before we get into it though, this particular episode of Council of Geeks is sponsored by Radio vs. the Martians. It's a podcast series that features Mike Gillis and Casey Dorn as they run down basically whatever geeky stuff they feel like talking about that given conversation. And they have all kinds of guests. They talk about Star Wars and Game of Thrones and comic books and Batman and wrestling and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Seriously, they're watching every Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. It's kind of amazing. So that's Radio vs. the Martians, radioversusthemartians.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, guys. Let's talk about the trope commonly referred to as bury your gays. Or bury your queers, because I think it applies to more than that. I've actually got quite a bit to cover here, so let's start by explaining what this trope even is and what the term means. Because it's important that everybody's operating on the same base level of knowledge here. In the simplest terms, it refers to the tendency of LGBTQ plus characters in entertainment, especially mainstream entertainment, to end up dead by the time the story that they appear in is concluded. This is the kind of thing I've actually wanted to talk about for a while, because it gets into the actual substance of representation rather than, you know, getting hung up on things like whether or not representation needs to be there at all, or why the creators chose to have it, or things like that. I've talked about that stuff a lot, but that's all like the preemptive. Now let's actually talk about when it happens. And to be really blunt about it, if you're some form of LGBTQ+, and a significant percentage, if not the majority, of characters in TV and movies that are also a part of that community end up dying, that doesn't leave you with the best feeling in the world. But we'll come back to that. Let's start with why this trope even exists in the first place. Its prevalence came about largely as a loophole that was exploited to be able to even use these kinds of characters to tell these kinds of stories at all, because there is and always has been a market for what is considered to be seedy or scandalous tales, which for a very long time, any kind of queer content would be considered to be that, just by its very nature. So for a long time, publishers, because we are talking like back at the printed word here, would not want to risk the ire of either governing officials or moral crusaders by appearing to advocate for deviancy. So they would basically just split the difference by not glamorizing the lifestyle and having the gay people end up dead. And that pretty much solved their problem. As long as the story's ultimate message in regard to being anything other than straight and cisgender was, it gets you killed or leaves you broken, well, it was more likely to be allowed through the gates and out into the world to actually be consumed as entertainment. A parallel comparison would be the Hays Code and how that treated depiction of criminals and drug use. The Hays Code, if you didn't already know, that was a set of restrictions that Hollywood actually imposed on itself about what could or couldn't be depicted in movies. It was in effect from 1930 to 1968 at most major studios, and one of its caveats was that criminal behavior was not to be depicted as sympathetic or glamorous. Now, you still got movies where the main character was a gangster, but the gangster had to be dead by the end of the movie. I mean, that was pretty much James Cagney's entire career as a lead actor. And while the Hays Code specifically forbade any overt depiction of what is considered sexual deviancy, their words, which led to the standardization of gay coding in film, but that's kind of a topic for another day. Most media around the same time basically appeared to adopt that general model that the Hays Code had for crime and use that approach when portraying LGBTQ plus characters. So this made all gay characters die the standard operating procedure for a very long time, and is one of the reasons why Patricia Highsmith's novel, The Price of Salt, which you may know better by its movie adaptation in 2015, Carol, it's why that story was so groundbreaking. Because prior to its 1952 publication, lesbian romance was a pretty well-established subgenre of pulp fiction, but they always ended in tragedy. And to say that The Price of Salt has a happy ending might be stretching it slightly, but it at least has a hopeful one. And everyone's still alive and well. How groundbreaking was this? Well, keep in mind that by this point, Highsmith already had a successful book turned into a Hitchcock movie with Strangers on a Train. But she wouldn't put her name on The Price of Salt, and actually didn't acknowledge authorship until 38 years later. When it was finally reprinted with her name on it in 1990, Highsmith herself summed up all of this best in the afterword of the book. She stated that prior to this book, homosexual male and females in American novels had to pay for their deviation by cutting their wrists, drowning themselves in a swimming pool, or by switching to heterosexuality. So it was stated. Or by collapsing, alone, miserable, and shunned into a depression equal to hell. So, okay, now we know why the trope was established and a bit about the period where it was leaned on the most heavily. Why is it stuck around into current entertainment? Well, a big part is it just has to do with how formative the years of fiction and entertainment were during the period when that was just kind of the way things were. I mean, The Price of Salt may have broken the taboo in 52, and the Hays Code may have gone away in 68, but before and even after that, there were decades of storytelling that locked in what was normal or expected when it came to depictions of all kinds of characters, and that included gay people. And those formulas, those tropes, they're really hard to shake off once they're embedded, especially if you're not actually consciously aware of them, which I would say many creators aren't, even today. I should actually zero in on the question of whether I'm addressing an outdated problem or does this actually still go on? Oh yeah, it definitely does. Though it gets called out way more than it used to. Like, for example, even if you haven't watched Netflix's Voltron series, which actually I haven't either, you may still have caught wind of the anger that was centered around the introduction and then killing off, after extremely brief appearances, of a gay character named Adam in a later season. There was also an element of queer baiting in there, since Adam had actually been teased on promotional material like he was some kind of major character and was really little more than a glorified extra, which actually feeds into my next point. Because while bury your gays, bury your queers, whichever, in regards to main characters, I would actually say it doesn't happen as often as it used to. It's still pretty prevalent when it comes to supporting characters. But I don't believe that to actually be by design, just rather by carelessness. By that, what I mean is, in most stories, there's an assemblage of supporting characters whose backstory is really never going to get delved into, and they're never really going to be driving the plot. It's therefore easy to just stamp these kinds of characters with any number of cast diversifying traits. And despite some cries of agenda, this is most often done for very practical purpose of just making characters more distinct from each other and easier to tell apart, especially in something like animation. So, you've written a story, you know your main characters through and through, but, there's 20 to 50 background and supporting characters who have plot function, but they don't require a ton of depth or detail. I mean, they're blank slates, and they could really be anything. So you go ahead and apply some easily established distinctions to help make them seem less generic, make the world feel more fleshed out. You make this one black, that one's Asian, that one's gay, that one's overweight, oh, this one's a god, hey, we'll have that one be in a wheelchair. Now, you can call this tokenism, but it is still just kind of what tends to happen, and I don't mean to paint this approach as automatically being a bad thing. In fact, it can help normalize the existence of marginalized or underrepresented groups to have them be just spread about and just exist. You know, almost like they're normal people. But it often means that not much care is given to the implications of making these kinds of characters, whatever it is you end up making them. It's the same root cause of the black characters in horror movies always die trope. It's not that horror movie directors or writers hate black people. It's that the diversity generally gets spread among the supporting cast, and the supporting cast in a horror movie is inherently more disposable and usually just there to be killed. So, when LGBTQ plus characters are dispersed among the supporting characters and that cast, it means that it's getting applied to what are frankly the most disposable and the most likely to be casually removed in order to up the stakes or establish a danger or impact one of the main characters by their dying. So now it's time to come back to how this kind of thing can leave the LGBTQ plus audience actually feeling. The frequency of this kind of thing, which, again, mostly happens by careless coincidence rather than by design, it reinforces this general idea that we are inherently less important and more disposable. Honestly, I find Bury Your Gays easier to defend when it's a lead character because there's usually some degree of thought and consideration going on there. You know, some degree of depth that gives context for why the trope is being used. I find the death of a gay character in something like Brokeback Mountain way easier to swallow than, say, the casual smearing of a gay character across the highway in Bride of Chucky. Boy, bet those films have never been directly compared before. But my point is that with supporting characters, where this whole thing is more prevalent, it just kind of happens. Dead queer. Whoopsie daisy. Oh well, moving on. And many LGBTQ plus audiences already have a pretty high degree of anxiety about our place in society, so getting this vibe off of entertainment doesn't really do much to assuage that. I can actually do a nice little compare and contrast within the same source for two comparison case studies. Let's start with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The first confirmed homosexual character on the show is that of Larry, introduced in the second season. He gets killed in the finale of season 3 with really no ceremony. Actually, it's so fast that it honestly didn't register with me that the hit he took would have killed him until it got confirmed outright in the 6th season. Killed so casually that you could easily miss the fact that he even died. Now contrast that with the death of Tara in that same 6th season that I mentioned. While still safely labeled a supporting character, Tara was at that point part of the main cast, actress in the opening credits, everything. And the show appropriately treated her death with the weight and the gravity one would want out of a character this important to both the other characters on the show and the fans. Now, it still is a bit of bury your gays, but I point this out to illustrate how the casual instances that are generally, the supporting character ones tend to be the bigger problem. Another contrast actually exists in Doctor Who between a litany of casually killed characters and the death, quote-unquote, of Series 10 companion Bill. Bill's death, again, is treated as a tragedy, as something with weight and meaning, and also, thankfully, doesn't happen because she's gay, so that helps. Less helpful, though, is that both before and after Bill, we have fodder deaths of characters offhandedly established as gay in episodes like Unicorn and the Wasp, Midnight, A Good Man Goes to War, Arachnids in the UK, even the latest episode that aired as of this taping, Resolution. Heck, look, Bill's inclusion under Bury Your Gays might even be questionable because she was kind of saved. And she was saved by what remains of a character who very clearly was a victim of Bury Your Gays, who had died in the very first episode of that season. Does one well-done highlighted character counterbalance the many dead fodder gay characters the show has produced? I mean, that's a call for any given viewer to make for themselves, but sometimes it does feel like the show is counting on that balancing out, since it hasn't stopped, since Bill came and went. So, not all of these instances are as egregious as others. You can refer back to my video on problematic patterns as to why the ubiquity of the trope is still a problem, regardless of the merits of some individual instances of its use. And to be clear, because I know somebody's going to claim otherwise, I'm not saying this means that you can never kill off a gay character. But the reason something is a trope isn't just that it's frequently used, it's that it's overused. It's expected. It's what pretty much always happens. And another word for that is a cliche. So a writer or director or creator of any kind should be approaching killing off an LGBTQ plus character the same way one should approach anything that is overdone. Approach it the same way you would, say, a damsel in distress. Because it's such a standard expectation that if you're going to use it, there had better be some thought behind how it actually plays out. Otherwise, we've seen it before. Because just using the trope straight is boring. It's expected, and it's lazy. So, of course, gay characters can die, but since that's such a cliche, maybe think about why you're doing it. And if you can't come up with a good reason, then maybe think about doing something else. If only to not be so dang predictable. So that's my thoughts on bury your gays, bury your queers, bury your non-hetero, non-cisgender folks. So, what are your thoughts on this trope? What do you think is the most egregious example you have seen of it? Or any other shots? Yes, let's share some shots. No, share your thoughts with me down in the comments. Let's talk about it. If you like what I did, I hope that you will hit the like button. That is a big help. Also consider subscribing. And if you really want to help out, I also have a Patreon where you can support me and help make this better. So, links for all that is down below. You know how the buttons work. You don't need me to tell you. So click on stuff. Have a good time. Or don't. You don't have to, because at the end of the day, folks, you're the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.